Hello everybody, I'm Jay Friendly and I'm here to talk about Drupal 8 architectural paradigms, the TypeData API. So I just have to start with a disclaimer, this is not the talk you are looking for. So the reason I say that is when I pitched this talk initially in August, I pitched as Drupal 8 paradigms and I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to talk about that time. And as I started to write the presentation over and over and over, I just kept getting to a certain point and I wasn't feeling it because I was thinking, I wanted to talk about plugins and I wanted to talk about services. And these are all good things for non-developers, but anyone who's already developing in Drupal 8 is going to know these things. So it kind of felt like not such a productive talk. So I've sort of switched it. It still is about a Drupal 8 architectural paradigm, but it's not about services and it's not about plugins. So if anyone wants to get up and jump ship right now, I won't be offended. Actually, I won't be offended even if you leave 5 minutes in. So see if you like it or not. Well, it looks like this is the slide we're watching for the rest of this presentation. Yeah. One. I'm Jay Friendly. So I'm Jay Pan on Drupal.org and Drupal Answers. I spend a lot of times on the forums. Most programmers have probably seen a big red dot that's associated with my name. I'm the red dot. I started on Drupal in 2007 in Drupal 5, and I maintain multiple modules on Drupal.org, including the Color API module, which I'll be referring to later on in this presentation. So I am the technical director at Morphed, and Morphed specializes in Drupal and GovCMS. We're a development agency located in Sydney, near Central Station. Morphed is focused on Drupal best practices. So I've worked with a number of agencies over my career, and this is definitely the most Drupal-y agency I've ever worked for/with. Thank you. So it feels good because I'm talking with people who actually know what I'm talking about. Morphed does a lot of contribution to the community in maintaining modules and also in meetups. Morphed puts on the Sydney Drupal meetups monthly. So if you're ever in Sydney, feel free to come by and say hello on our meetup night. And Morph writes a bunch of technical blog posts to help out members of the community. So as I said, I'm the technical director, and with that I'm determining the technical direction of the company. So that means I'm looking at new technologies. Specifically, we're looking at how to implement testing systems into our systems more effectively, and potentially using systems like React to interact with Drupal as a backend. And so I'll be looking at the methodology we'll be using in our company. And I got to maintain my Drupal knowledge to do that. So the way I maintain my Drupal knowledge is in my contributed modules. I like to try and develop them and keep up with Drupal APIs and integrate them with Drupal as best I can so that a wide range of users can use the modules I maintain. And I like to write blog posts. At the moment, I have 2 new blog posts on morph.com regarding Composer. I found when I started to use Composer, it wasn't really explained anywhere why or how or anything like that. So I'm putting together a 4-part comprehensive series on using Composer with Drupal. You can check it out on morph.com. The first 2 parts are out. The first one is just understanding Composer in general for site builders. And then the second one is specifically how to use the Drupal Composer template to build Drupal 8 sites. And I liaise with clients, so I sit down and I tell them Drupal things in non-Drupal talk. And I present at conferences like this. So, Drupal 8, I'm just going to give a bit of a brief overview of the changes. So it's a massive rewrite from Drupal 7. It's an entirely massive rewrite on the back end. Drupal 7 was using procedural code, whereas Drupal 8 switched to OOP code. Plus they've introduced a lot of architectural paradigms, which I was originally going to talk about, but am not now. Most Drupal 7 APIs are continued in Drupal 8. So we've got entities, fields, taxonomies, users, and then there's some new APIs that have been introduced as well. Plugins, configuration, and the TypeData API, which is what I will be talking about today. So I originally got onto this because, as I said, I maintain some modules on Drupal.org, and one of the modules I maintain is the jQuery color picker module. So this module from Drupal 6 and Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 version 1 was all essentially, it was just an extension from CCK and Drupal 6 through to Drupal 8, but it essentially created a new field type, like a string, and then gave a jQuery color picker as a widget to be able to select a color from a widget, to be able to maintain colors. As I got into Drupal 8, I just updated the Drupal 7 module to Drupal 8, and it worked, but I started to realize there's all these things in there that weren't really explained, and I started seeing this TypeData API. And me being the guy I am, I Googled TypeData API, and I found a bunch of stuff that didn't really clear it up for me at all. And the documentation was just really confusing on Drupal.org. I went in there, and basically it's like, this is how you use it. And it gave a bunch of code examples and how to declare a new one, but there was no explanation on what the TypeData API was. And it took me about a year to figure it out as I was updating this module. And when I finally did figure it out, it was this revelation. I was like, oh my goodness, all of Drupal 8 is built on this API, and it's not explained anywhere. It's entirely, I shouldn't say entirely, but there definitely wasn't a good explanation that I could find anywhere. I'm sure someone has written something somewhere, but unfortunately it wasn't in an easy to find location. So that's why I'm going to talk about it today. One comment on my presentation today. Does anyone know Stephen Hawking, A Brief History in Time, the book? Okay, I see a few hands. Has anyone actually read it? I gotta see a couple more hands. So at the very start of that book, there was a really interesting comment in there that's always sat with me. And Stephen Hawking's publisher or editor or someone told him, for every physics function you put into this book, you're going to cut your readership in half. And so if you read A Brief History in Time, there's only one equation in the whole book, and that's E equals mc squared, which most people can at least deal with. So in this presentation, I've tried to go the same idea. Rather than showing how to use the TypeData API and how to implement new TypeData API objects, I'm just going to talk about it. So I've left all code out of this presentation. So first, I want to review a history of data types in Drupal. So in Drupal 3, we got nodes. And this was from the release notes of Drupal 3. I'm going to let you read it while I have a drink of coffee. All right, I saw one thumbs up, so I hope that means everyone got to read it. But essentially, someone had a really good idea and put nodes into Drupal 3. And it's been a major differentiating factor between Drupal and all the other CMSs since. So that was a big revelation. And so in Drupal 3, we got nodes. In Drupal 7, we got entities. And nodes were a type of entity. So they took the node API and they actually extended it. So now you could have different types of entities that worked like nodes, but nodes was just a generic quantity or entity type. So we had node. We also got comments, files, taxonomy terms, taxonomy vocabularies, and users. So these were all entity types that shipped with Drupal 7. In Drupal 7, we also got the field API, which came from CCK in Drupal 6. And then in Drupal 8, we get the TypeData API. So, sorry, I'm going to start. Let's talk about data types. So programmers work with data types a lot. It's what we do. And PHP has its base data types. So from PHP, we get string, which is text, an integer, which is a whole number, a Boolean, which is a true or false, null, which is nothing, array, which is a list of items, and objects, which are items with named properties. So these all come from PHP, and Drupal is built on PHP. Problem is PHP is loose with its data types. And for programmers who have worked with other languages, this is a major concern for them. They just feel it's real sloppy a lot of the time, especially if you talk to like Java developers. So in other programming languages, if you try to add the number 1 plus the string 2, so it's the same 2, but it's not a number, it's a piece of text. Other languages will either throw an error or throw a warning, whereas Drupal just does, or sorry, not Drupal, PHP just does something. So if you add the number 1 plus the string 2, it will actually give you 3 as a number, even though it's in differentiating data types.
That's the difference between TypeScript and non-TypeScript languages. JavaScript and that you know the same problem.
No, and that's exactly the point I'm getting at.
Computer science term, right? It's not a TypeScript language.
Yeah, and that's why people think it's sloppy. So you can add an integer to a string or a Boolean. which makes for an easy entry into programming. So that's the nice thing about PHP. That's where this relaxed data types comes in, because as a brand new programmer, if you're trying to add like the number 1 and the string 2 and you get an error, it's confusing. It's like, but this is 1 and this is 2, why am I not getting 3? So this allows for an easier entry into development. The problem being that it also allows for potentially unstable code because you're mixing data types, and that can add instability. So Drupal is an enterprise level system. And as such, it requires, I'm having some troubles here. All right. So it requires consistency of data. When you're dealing with enterprise level data, you can't afford to have these data inconsistencies. So the TypeData API, actually, sorry, I'll go a little further. So Drupal is data management, and we've got high-level Drupal data types like entities. And there's content entities and configuration entities. Now in Drupal 7, there was only one type of entity. It was just content entities, essentially. Drupal 8 it took the entity API and split it up. So now you have content entities, which are content like a blog post or an article. And you have configuration entities, which are like items of configuration. So I'm going to get into this a little further because it's a little tricky at this moment, and I'm just going to move forward. And then we also got the field API, which allows for site builders to create data types through the API, because they can create a node content type or a new entity content type and add fields to it. So it allows for really dynamic data management without having to always write code to handle it. And so you can attach fields to content entities. You can't attach fields to configuration entities. So now let's get to the core of my presentation, the TypeData API. So now my thing's going crazy again. The TypeData API, it bridges primitive PHP data types with complex Drupal data types. So we're working in a loose typed system like PHP, but we're setting it up to be able to handle enterprise systems like Drupal. And it creates a common interface for these data types. So for example, all TypeData API objects have a getValue method. And this is, I think, the only code I actually use in this whole presentation is that getValue. But basically, anytime you have a TypeData API object, you can call this getValue method, and you'll get some value. Depending on what the object is, it's going to give back different things, but you'll get something out of it. So this makes for more stable code. And TypeData API objects can have constraints. So for example, So there's an email TypeData API object provided by Core. And this object, it's two things really. It's a string, and it's got a constraint. And that constraint is that the string, which is a piece of text, must be in the format of an email address. So this has already gone beyond PHP primitive data types, because PHP primitive data types don't have constraints. Well, they can have constraints if it's like an array or something, but this adds new ones on. So it's Drupal's extending of PHP. And TypeData API objects also hold metadata about the object itself. So for example, the data type of the object can be retrieved. Now it might seem weird that you have an object and you don't know the type of data, but it happens. I could dig way deep down into some programming stuff, but I'm not going to. But this just allows us to say, hey, object, what are you? And it'll say, I'm an email, or I'm a string, or I'm a whatever it is. PHP also has a function to get that data out of it, but it's not nearly as robust as what comes with the TypeData API. So the TypeData API, it creates the building blocks of Drupal. So and Core provides a number of base data types that can be used by the other parts of Drupal. So for example, a URL, an email address, and a timestamp. So anyone who's created content through Drupal generally knows about the created timestamp. Now in Drupal 8, this is a property of type timestamp. So it's Drupal creating a specific item that matches Drupal 8 coding. And so the TypeData API, there's three different types of them. The first one is simple data. So simple data holds a single value. So equivalents exist for the primitive PHP data types. So there's a Drupal TypeData API string object, which holds a PHP string. There's an integer object, which holds an integer, and so on. Oh, and so on. String, integer, Boolean. And then Core also provides some additional types, such as email, URL, timestamp. There's also changed. So when you change the timestamp on a node, that's a separate object type itself. Developers can also create new types, and that's what I've done in the Color API module, which is what I will be getting to later on in this presentation. So next, there's complex data. So complex data holds multiple values and key value pairs. So for example, you could have an RGB color object, which would have 3 keys, red, blue, and green, and each value is an integer between 0 and 255. So this object here describes an RGB color, which is made up of these 3 things. So it's a complex data object built off simple data objects. And these are conceptually equivalent to a PHP object. It's not exactly the same because it's Drupal and it does a bunch of stuff, but as a concept, it's an easy way to consider it. And the last type of TypeData API object is list data. And a list data holds an ordered list of items. And these items can be any other simple or complex type data object. So field API fields always return list data. So even if when you declare a new field in code, you declare the properties on it. So even if I could declare a property email, the actual value that comes back from the field is a list of email objects. So now people who've created new content types through Drupal know you can select the number of items that it'll hold. Whether you select 1, whether you select 10, whether you select unlimited, all of them actually end up just creating an array or a list of items. And when there's only one value, then the first value is filled in. If it's unlimited, then there's a number. But the list itself holds whatever the type it's specified to hold. These are conceptually equivalent to PHP arrays, but not named arrays, not keyed arrays, just like indexed arrays, 0 to whatever it goes up to. So let's take a look at the data hierarchy. I've mentioned a few times so far that the TypeData API creates the building blocks of Drupal. So fields from the field API, they have properties. So when you're creating a new field type, you list out the properties and you say what they are. These properties themselves are TypeData API objects. So content entities have base field definitions, which are also TypeData API objects, and then you can attach field API fields to the content type. So both of these are TypeData API objects themselves. Configuration entities, they can't take fields, but they do have properties. And these properties are also TypeData API objects. So all data types in Drupal boil down to a series of typed data API object types. So if you have a node has a bunch of base properties. Each property is going to relate to a given type data API type. So for example, I talked about the change time, the creation time, the author. These are all or the title of the node. These are all base properties on the node. And they all refer to a given type data API object type. As well, when you attach fields themselves have properties on them, and each of these properties ends up being a type data API object. So all data in Drupal ends up boiling down to a whole lot of these different type data API object types. And this, I'm eventually going to get to, ties into configuration. So these type data API objects are kind of like Drupal Lego. You build the little pieces, and then you take them and you start to build bigger pieces and bigger pieces and bigger pieces until you have a big Drupal Legoland. So I created the Color API module. So well, I think I did at least. In creating this module, where it came from was I initially talked about the jQuery color picker module that I created, and I had a data type in there called jQuery color picker. But that's not a data type. That's just the widget. That's just how it ended up coming from Drupal 6 CCK to 7 to 8. So when I started to write version 2 of this module, I started to get deeper into the type data API, and so it was kind of, I used this module before I released it. I actually learned how this all worked. Just made a bunch of code that threw a whole bunch of errors and figured out where these errors were coming from and went through and refined it again. And eventually, as I started to clear it up, I started to see, this is how it works. This is how it comes together. So this module is kind of two things. One, it's an API for managing colors within Drupal, but also for me, it's an example of how to build things using the type data API at its base level. So this module is at this URL, and I think I loaded that up in preparation. But that's not going to happen. So anyways, this module does exist. It heavily integrates with the type data API. So it builds elements used for managing colors in Drupal. Now I tried to hit every level for people. I tried to hit the widget level, I tried to hit the TypeData API level, the field level, the configuration entity level, so that anyone who needs to manage colors for some reason, whatever it may be, is able to have something complete that they can use out of the box, but also use the pieces from if they want to put together their own modules that build off of this. So the module provides simple data types, or one simple data type actually, a hexadecimal color. So hexadecimal color is a string that starts with a pound sign and finishes off with a hexadecimal number. Hexadecimal number is anything between 0 and 9 and then A to F. So these are hexadecimal colors here. So this TypeData API type, it allows for a string and it has a constraint added to it that says it has to be this format. If it's not that format, you get a little error that says, please enter it in this format. And then this module provides complex data types. So the first one is RGB color, and I mentioned this earlier in the presentation. So an RGB color holds a red value between 0 and 255, a green or blue value the same, and a green value. I just realized I got my colors mixed up from the acronym, but let's just ignore that. And then finally, it creates a complex data object of color, which might seem weird because I just described two colors, but this color is actually, it's a hexadecimal, it's got two named properties. One is a hexadecimal color, and the other is RGB color. So you can already see here, even just within TypeData API objects, I'm building more complex TypeData API objects. I started with a simple hexadecimal color, I started with an RGB color, and then I created a new object that actually holds both of them. So developers that want to use the pieces of this, if they just need a hexadecimal color, they can use that TypeData API object. Or if they want an RGB color, they can use that. Or if they need a full color, they have the option of something that encloses both. At some point in time, I might extend this to hold data in other formats as well. So the module also provides a color field API field. And it's just got one property, which is color. Now, on the last slide, I showed how I created the color complex TypeData API object. This field has one property. That property is a color. The color holds a hexadecimal color and an RGB color. So you can start to see how this is building up. So now developers can, or not even developers, site builders can add a color field to their content types or to their entities, which now allows this, the storage of these low-level colors to be used in various ways. The module, I ended up, what I did with the jQuery color picker modules, I mentioned earlier that originally I had a data type called jQuery color picker, but that's not a data type. So instead what I did was I ended up extending, that module is now just a widget for this data type. So the data type is now color, and I have the jQuery color picker module, which is a field API widget that allows you to select the color. Without that module, you actually just get a text field where you have to manually enter the color. But this way, developers can also add different widgets over top of this. So you still have the color underground with different widgets to collect the color information above. So developers could create an RGB widget, which actually you put in the maybe a slider between 0 to 255 for the 3 values, or whatever. And I might do that at some point myself when I have a little more time on my hands. It also creates a color configuration entity. Now, some sites will need colors as configuration for whatever reason. They want something a little more powerful. And so this is actually a new entity type. And you create them through the UI, but these are exportable to content so that the colors can be shared between different sites. So if you need colors as part of like a core type of entity on your system, this color configuration entity provides that. And it's got two properties. It's got the name, which is a string. It's a human readable name. So blue, and then you're going to put a blue, or it might be asphalt blue, and you're going to choose some nearest to blue value. And then property 2 is color, which again is my color complex data object. So I've started very low on this and built these all the way up. And actually one thing I didn't mention in here, because it's not really related to the TypeData API, is I also created a form API element type called color element. And so what that is it's actually you can just drop in a color picture from the Drupal API, and it will, when creating forms in code, and it will handle that. So I've tried to hit everything I could with color on this. So coming soon, I'm writing a book on data management in Drupal 8. I mentioned at the start of this talk that I wouldn't be including any code in it, and I didn't, except for the one function in there. And my goal is actually, this talk is sort of the talk about what's happening. The book is everything that I've talked about here, but will include code explanations so that people can understand how to create their own TypeData API objects. As far as the target audience, it's not really going to be for many people other than those who are creating new field API types for the most part. It's good for understanding a deep level of understanding of Drupal, but it's not actually a part of Drupal that most developers will ever use. It's very low level. And so that's all I have to say. I'm opening up for questions.
First of all, I would like to thank you because this data type concept is very, or type data concept is very complex in Drupal core. Even the maintainer of type data API in core has said several times, like, I don't understand what is going on. It's that complex. So if you are confused by this, don't be. You are all on the same board there. It's a very unique approach for the color element, and I think it's not a question. It's just a like observation that we can expand it for layout builder where you can have a layout color or the section color or whatever the block, wherever the block is appearing, you can have that color there. So it's really good implementation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there, thank you. You talked about type data objects in various contexts, configuration and content entities and fields as well. I wondered if typed data objects can exist outside of the scope of being attached to an entity.
Well, they already do because they're the building blocks of entities. So let's see how I can explain this. Field API fields are actually themselves complex type data API objects. So if you actually go through the hierarchy of the OOP class structure, you get back to the point where a field is actually itself a complex data object with named properties. Those are just dynamically created by developers when they build out the class that builds an item. So they already do exist on their own. You could, this is one thing I found very confusing, is on Drupal.org, on the documentation page, there's a section there. This is how you create a type data API object through code. I was like, okay, and I figured it out, and sure enough, you could do it, and I got left with, why? And I was lost at that, and I tried using that approach for like building my module, and it just wasn't making sense. And what I realized was, okay, well, that's how you can do it, but you almost never need to, because these actually exist for almost entirely. They're created by the system, not created by the system, but you deal with already created type data API objects because they are properties on entities, properties on fields. So they could exist outside, but there's not really much of a use case that I personally have been able to see for that. I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, feel free to elaborate.
I will elaborate, because I saw a suggestion a few days ago that path aliases being made part of the entity system. And I went, what? Like, that sounds like a lot of overhead on path aliases. And I'm wondering if type data objects, if they can exist independently of a parent entity, and if Drupal provides ways to access them, then perhaps that would be a path forward for that use case, for example.
I can't really fully answer what you asked, but what I can speculate is how you would use the type data API to work with path aliases. It depends on how complex of an object that you want, but you could just create a type data API object for path, and then you could give it a constraint such as it needs to have a / at the very minimum, which for a path, that is actually the very minimum, is just the / to start it. And then you could check other things to make sure it has like values allowed in paths, although I think in Drupal almost anything's actually allowed in a path. So the other thing you could do though is, because aliases, they're actually, sorry, I'm thinking this out while I'm talking. So aliases also have a language associated with them. So it's not going to be, you could create a complex data object that held the path and the language, or you could create a configuration entity with two properties, one being I'm starting to get lost here, one being the language, and language actually is a type that's provided by core, and then the next one would be the alias itself, and maybe you could have a third one. So I would say that probably for the path alias, like for the path auto module, the best thing would be to create configuration objects with complex data or type data API objects as part of that, and that way it makes the whole content entity exportable through configuration to go to other environments if you're going like through production and development and dev or whatnot.
Thank you. wrong. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, do you have any idea, like the runtime overhead of these types, like this TypeData API? Like I imagine it needs to load up and construct all these fields and types and whatnot. Do you know like how much overhead that would introduce? Or?
At the low level, the TypeData API level, not very much. It's essentially just a single PHP class. So you're creating an object. And so that's not entirely true because TypeData APIs, they have the definition, like the dictionary or the data definition, as well as the actual data type. So it's two types that associate with each other. To be honest, I don't think it would be much. I think it's your just standard OOP, open up a class, dump some data into it, because that data is going to come either from the data, well, it is going to come from the database. It's configuration in the database, so it's going to come and just be dropped in that class. So the real overhead comes when you start to build fields and entities, but that's always been an issue with Drupal. It's nothing, this hasn't introduced any overhead on that level. I mean, I imagine if you were to compare not having the TypeData API and having it, there would be some difference because it's doing something, but I would bet that it's almost negligible. I'm here all day.
This is a little bit tangential. I noticed you didn't have an alpha channel in there for the color. It's just like a little nitpick. Is that something you're supporting in the color module?
I am not a color expert.
Yeah.
I do feel pretty confident about the TypeData API, but I don't know a lot about colors. What I do know about colors is they have an RGB color and a hexadecimal color, and so that's what I built. That sounds like something we should talk about after, so I can make my module even better. Because I do want to make it like an entire. My personal goal is to get it introduced into core at some point in time. So the more complete I can make it, and the more color stuff that it integrates, the more likely that is to happen over time. And if anyone wants to help me promote that getting into core, please contact me. I need the support.
Anyone else? No, that's it. Please thank Jane.